Good evening, everybody. My name is Philip S. Bolger-Cortez, and I am a defense wargamer at the LeMay Center. I'm going to give you guys a talk tonight on Air Force Wargaming, both what it is now and what I hope it should be. And I need to emphasize, this is what I hope it should be. I'm not here speaking on behalf of the Air Force or Air Education and Training Command, Air University, or any other DoD agency. These are just the thoughts of Philip S. Bolger-Cortez. So please don't take that away as anything else. I don't speak for the government right now. I just speak as a guy with opinions on parts of the government. So that's all they are my thoughts and my opinions. So let's get into it. So tonight I'm going to tell you a little bit about first who I am, what perspective I bring, and also a little bit about what affinities and biases I have. Everybody's colored by those, and you guys got to hear my thoughts on this. You should be aware up front of sort of how I think. I want to talk about what I mean when I say Air Force Wargaming. I think that you could do an entire 2-hour presentation on the definition of wargaming, and in fact, going through the Goose event history, several people have. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to tell you guys, going to take a narrow slice as what I identify. I want to talk a little bit about the direction of the Air Force writ large. If you've been keeping up with Air Force news, if you subscribe to Air Force Magazine and read the releases that come out through there, or if you keep up if you're a defense news junkie in general, some of that might be a little new or a little redundant for you. Very little of it will be new, but it's necessary to lay the ground for how does Air Force wargaming with that. And I got the two big parts of tonight are Air Force wargaming strengths and Air Force wargaming challenges. We got a lot of strengths, we got a lot of challenges. Both are worth discussing. And last, where do we go from here? So first, let me tell you a little bit about me. Believe it or not, I have 0 days in uniform in the Air Force. I am an Army veteran. I served 5 years in the United States Army, including a deployment to Afghanistan, 2012 to 2013, where I served as an advisor. The picture here is with me and the man I advised, Safar Muhammad, who was a captain at the time of this photo, was promoted to major. With the aftermath of our withdrawal, I think about him a lot, and I hope he's okay. I don't really know, though, but that experience shaped me a lot as well with sort of how I understand the military, how I understand practical operations. I'm also a game designer. I made a battle pack for Danvers and Games Warfighter World War II. The battle pack was on the Battle of Tarawa, but unusually, I chose to portray it from the perspective of the Japanese. This is not because I have any love of Imperial Japan. I think that they made a lot of horrible choices and committed a lot of horrible war crimes. However, I was very fascinated, very captivated by the idea of what level of fanaticism must exist to fight with the ferocity they did on Tarawa. They started with a strength of about 2,000 Special Naval Landing Forces and some additional engineers and attachments, and 17 IJN Special Naval Landing Forces, their Marine equivalents, left alive. All of them were captured by the American Marines. That was fascinating to me. So I wanted to build that in a quick playing game. Warfighter World War II is a very actionized game, but I still thought that was a chance to tell that story. I'm working on another couple games, also with Danvers and Games. I can't really talk much more about them right now. I don't want to cross the wires, but if you look me up look up my author page on Facebook, I have a link there that will give more information. So I'm a defense wargamer. That's been my professional job. That's what I do every day, and it's great. I love it. I would not trade it for the world. It is a great gig if you can get it. You get to play games all day that impact the fate of the United States, as it were, in the defense realm. This also means that I think like a defense wargamer, which sometimes is good and sometimes is bad. Defense decision makers generally don't think like defense wargamers. Defense decision makers, whether uniformed or civilian, have a different job. They don't always look at strategy and tactics. They have to do the care and feeding of soldiers. They have to do, hey, is the budget right? They have to do any number of other tasks that are also crucially important. But that means that when you talk to them, you have to be able to bridge your terminology and your thinking with their terminology and their thinking. By academic training, I'm a historian. I only have a humble undergraduate degree. It is from the United States Military Academy at West Point, beat Navy, but it's an undergrad degree. It's an undergrad degree in history. So history shapes a lot of how I think and a lot of how I approach war games. I tend to think of what historical analogies were there, as well as what historical context led us to today. I can say working with the Air Force, which is largely a future-looking organization, that has been an interesting perspective to bring. And finally, I'm an author. I'm a creative type. I like writing. In addition to game design, I have one published novel out and several published short stories. This shows that I don't necessarily think as well as some of our more doctrine experts that are very just the facts, ma'am, or some of the modeling and sim people that are very scientific. I really admire that type of thinking. I think it is absolutely essential for defense. However, I am much more of an artist than a scientist. I rely on other people to do competent science for me. So I am telling you all of this, not just so you get a sense of who I am and a little bit to know me, but to know that everything else I talk about in this presentation should be viewed through that lens. I think of things as a game designer, not a modeling and sim expert. I know enough about modeling and sim to incorporate it in some of my games or to feed game data out to modeling and sim personnel, but that's not who I am. I am a historian. I'm not a futurist. I've worked with futurists. They're cool people. They have a lot of neat ideas. And I mean, I think what's coming the next 20 or 30 years, if they're right, is going to be pretty awesome just in general, not just for those of us in defense. And with that, the last one, of course, I come from an Army background. Working with the Air Force, coming from an Army background is interesting. It's definitely better, I think, than the other way around. The Army is very much, with respect to my former service, brute force and ignorance, and proud of it. You think of the types of people that dominate the Army, and there are very cerebral people. I don't want to discount that, but what they're really good at is direct application missions or direct action missions, stuff where the infantry charges up the hill and they know a bunch of them are going to die, but they go courageously anyway because they got to complete the mission. They have armored thinkers that are very, very decisive, very meat eater types. The Air Force is a little different. The Air Force has people in uniform with much more narrow specialties, up to including physicists and programmers, which they may exist in the Army, but they don't interact with line troops. Here they do. The Air Force physicists and programmers go out and talk with the operational force sometimes. So there's good and bad. My Army perspective isn't totally helpful. My Army perspective isn't totally harmful, but it does mean that that's how I see everything. So that is about me. I'm not going to take questions on this slide because I really want to get into the meat of the presentation. So when I talk wargaming, what do I mean? I rebuilt this slide probably about 14 times for this presentation. And I tried a couple different actual definitions and I hated all of them. But I was going back and rereading Matt Caffrey's On Wargaming, which is a book that I think is essential to pick up if you care about what is defense wargaming and how does it matter. I do have my own biases. He's also very interested in history. I would tell you the history part of his book is useful, but you could also just read the part on specifically how to design and what is a war game. I think you'd still get a lot out of it. Although obviously, if you have the time, I recommend reading the whole book. What he says is a favorite analogy of mine is to think of war games as, quote, flight simulators for decision makers, end quote. War games can train the mind to react to changing situations in the same way a flight simulator can prepare air crews to respond correctly and quickly to emergencies. Now, by his own admission, Matt does not say this is a definition, but I actually think it's the best way to explain how the Air Force in particular views war games. Ideally, these are supposed to show operators, whether they be future Air Operations Center operators, joint force operators, or even lower level operators at the wing or squadron level, what the picture of the battlefield might look like and give them a way to talk about it. So I could spend all day on the definition of war games. I really want to move through that, but just so you guys know, this is the base for what do I think Air Force Wargaming is, and even what it should be, all falls within this idea of flight simulators. So let's talk about difficulties of gaming in the air domain. I think the absolute hardest part of it, and coming from an Army background, I'm very cognizant of this, is the speed of air warfare. Air warfare moves much quicker than maritime or ground warfare. It moves slower than cyber warfare, but everything moves slower than cyber warfare in terms of instantaneous effects. Although I will tell you, having talked with Air Force cyber operators, just because the effect is instantaneous, please do not assume that what made that effect is instantaneous. Speed of air warfare is difficult to game because it means you're playing a game either in real time very quickly or in turns that have seemingly arbitrary amounts of time. Where you do air planning, if you work in an air operations center or if you work in air tasking order, can be in incredibly narrow slices of time that aircraft cross incredibly broad distances. Just this week, I was talking with a B-52 operator in my office, and we were discussing the results of a recent game in which, due to the planning, he was not allowed to move 200 nautical miles to get to a better launch path for his target. He was more or less livid by that. I was like, well, could you tell me why? He's like, well, yeah, because in a B-52, that's a 30-minute flight. So in a turn that takes 24 hours, he was very irritated that well within the capabilities of his airframe, he was not able to get where he needed to in order to complete his mission. You will find that this is frequently the case with Air Force Wargaming, and perhaps more irritating is that different Air Force assets do not operate at the same speeds. Something like a B-52 high subsonic is going to be slower than something like one of our fighter aircraft that can go above the speed of sound and get places very rapidly, although they also run out of fuel very quickly. And then you have to deal with the fuel problems. That speed and that layered speed, how do you synchronize effects between an MQ-9, an F-35, an AWACS, a tanker, a B-52, all these varied Air Force platforms, and that's only including the air domain. We're not even talking about cyberspace domains, both of which the Air Force also has a lot of interest in. It's difficult to game. It's not impossible, but it usually means that as you're constructing the game, you have to sacrifice realism in one domain in order to play the other domain better, or otherwise the game takes 2 weeks to finish. Sometimes that's acceptable, such as for a Title X war game, which is a war game that's required by mandate. But other times it's not. The other thing is that there's a lot of complexity of what I'm going to call air battle space geography. This is an awkward term. It's not a doctrinal term. This is Phil's Army brain attempting to explain having to factor in altitude as well as latitude and longitude, and a lot of different types of altitude. And then when you have to do that at scale for, let's say, 1,000 entities in a game, that could be very difficult to visually represent. It's not impossible, but it's challenging in a way that for Army troops represented on a map, they're subject to the terrain they're in. Even the helicopters that the Army has aren't going to fly at the heights that aircraft fly, and they're not going to be stacked on top of each other like Air Force aircraft. The technical sensitivity of Air Force programs makes it real difficult to make an unclassified and easily approachable game. The Air Force somewhat overclassifies things, but there is a good reason why they're so sensitive about this. Air combat is incredibly technical, and the details of how is a missile seeing a target, or exactly how fast does the aircraft go, or exactly at what time would it run out of fuel, how much fuel does it consume. These are all valuable intelligence, both for us and our adversaries. As a result, a lot of Air Force stuff is tightly controlled. Now, most of this exists in some sort of an open source format. You can go to Wikipedia right now and look at the F-35 stats on there, and you will walk away with F-35 stats that can be gameable. The question is, are they realistic? Is an F-35 pilot going to sit down in a chair and look at the stats you pulled off of Wikipedia and say, this is okay? If he's not, that's going to be a problem. Now, in some cases, they do. I have met pilots that are okay playing a lower sensitivity of games that mean that they don't represent the full realism of their systems. But in return, you can bring in a wider audience, and that can be valuable, especially in the Air University environment where we have foreign officers that you still want to tell about some of the systems we have. So something else to think about there. The fourth bullet, though, is one of the big ones. So my wargaming background, before I came to work wargaming in the Air Force, I worked wargaming at OSDK, which was a terrific wargaming shop. It was an absolutely great place to get an intro to wargaming and get a sense of what is defense wargaming. It's a very prestigious shop with a lot of different types of games across the Joint Force. And I did play Air Force games there as well, which is what steered me towards trying to go work for the Air Force when I left there. The problem is, the air domain is undergamed in the commercial world. If I go on to Board Game Geek right now and look up games about tanks, I'm going to find hundreds, maybe thousands. If I go on to Steam right now and look at ground-centric games, whether first-person shooters focusing on the infantry or real-time strategy focusing on a mix of things, or individual tank sims, I can find a lot. For aircraft, I can basically find games that are individual flight sims. I've listed here Ace Combat, War Thunder, DCS World. This really spans the spectrum, in my opinion. Ace Combat is kind of cartoony. It's really what if Air War was an anime, but it's still a good introduction to how do all these different systems work, what kind of things are valuable in Air War, Oh, and the importance of missile warning is also a good thing for base combat. War Thunder, kind of in the mid-range. There's a realistic mode in that game that forces you to take more things into account. There's a simulation mode that I find too intimidating to play, so I'd have to ask an actual pilot to say how good it is. It's also cartoony in the arcade mode, but still good for, do you want to learn basics of fighter combat? Do you want to learn what it's like to try to dive on somebody? Do you want to learn why bombers need escorts? The game will show you that. And the DCS world is a very realistic sim, which was also too intimidating for me, though I did give it an honest try. But the problem is all of that is individual aircraft. Individual aircraft, the Air Force already has its own sims, and they're just fine. So we can't really take these commercial sims and modify them to play our games because we don't need them. We can't really take the Air Force sims to play our games because they don't scale that well. You can kind of fly a few people at a time. Like recently, the Air Force Academy, they have an effects lab now where they will fly a bunch of sim stories all at the same time, all linked. That's pretty cool. That's still a pretty nascent capability, and it's not one that we could play over, let's say, 40 different stations coming together for a theater airplane. Outside of individual aircraft, a lot of other games tend to focus more on effects generated from the air as part of a larger fight. I mentioned 3 video games here. Warno, which is by Origin Studios, same guys that did the Wargame series. It's a fun game if you like Cold War gone hot stuff, but the air in it is more or less nonsensical. Your sorties generate from somewhere off map where you never have to worry where they are, and they fly a straight line route, not adjusting altitude at all. And then they drop their effects and they fly a straight right out. And if there's enemy air defense in the area, they just die. There could be better AI in the game, but it's hard to put AI on aircraft that are traveling at 6 times the speed of anything on the ground, and that's at the slowest. So that goes back to speed makes it complex. Does that mean that Warno does bad air effects? Well, no, because it's not a game about air. It's a game about the Army. It's a game about ground combat, and it shows how air effects can go in there. And that's sort of one of the issues is it's frequent to find air as it's already been abstracted in a way that it shows it here. Command and Conquer, very cartoony in general. The idea of the industrial supply chain being right on the battlefield is something that only makes sense in competitive RTSs. But it does show air. There's air in a couple different versions of Command and Conquer, all the way back to the first one from the 90s, having an A-10 airstrike that you can only call in once you destroyed all the enemy air defenses in the GDI campaign, which I would find out going to work for the Air Force is a very realistic expectation. Then lastly, command monitored operations. So I think this is probably the highest end, and I think it's the one closest to what I would like. I can't say that the LeMay Center has used command monitored operations. I think it's a pretty good platform overall. I do think it has its limitations. Every model does. Once again, scale is a limitation. Anybody that's run command can tell you that there is a certain number of entities that once you put in it, the engine's going to have trouble running that. I won't say whether or not those entities are realistic for a theater level fight, but if you want to drop me a line on government email, we can talk more about that. There's not a lot of thoughts in any of these, though, up to and including command, about the nuts and bolts of air planning. You don't make an air tasking order. You don't make an airspace control plan. You just kind of individually pivot around all these units. And that's because from an RTS perspective, all of these are single player games where the goal really is to challenge yourself strategically and at least initially have fun, although Command PE, which is the professional edition of Command Modern Operations, is oriented at actual defense analysis. Trying to take a game that's about one person having fun and turning into an air ops can be difficult. I didn't mention any board games. I do play a lot of board games, and I think board gaming has applications in the air domain. I will say there are some out there. Obviously, I'm partial to Dan Burson games. I've freelanced with them. I think they're pretty good. And they do a good job showing an approachable way to get to air operations planning in their leader series, but it's only for one squadron. And the way squadrons are composed in that game are not really how squadrons fight. And incidentally, anybody that's done air planning can tell you the Air Force doesn't really fight as squadrons. Squadrons are what generate combat power, but then that combat power is sent through an air tasking order, and that air tasking order run through the Air Operations Center is really what's going to fight the Air Force's air fight in any conflict. So with that, this means that I can't do what I like to do when I was at Cape, which was take a similar enough commercial design and sort of rip out core mechanics and start modernizing it or modifying it as necessary to meet my clients' analytical goals. There are some exceptions that exist. If you would like a game that will make you feel how it is to be an actual airplane, GMT's Red Storm is good for this. That said, it is a very high complexity game, not a coincidence. Air planning is a high complexity job. There's a lot of goodness in Red Storm, but I think it is too difficult of a game for me to teach to most of my clients, which is one of the other problems. Most people I deal with aren't gamers, or they are gamers, but not in that way. However, that I'm going to lead to later. That said, I would like to ask if there's any questions about the difficulties of gaming in the air domain.
So Phil, we have two questions and they're sort of related, and they wanted your opinion or assessment of both AFSIM and Birds of Prey. Birds of Prey being the commercial title by Ad Astra Games, and AFSIM being the Air Force simulation.
So I'm familiar with AFSIM. I think AFSIM is a good simulation. I don't think it's good for most of the types of operational wargaming that we're asked to do. However, I think there's a lot of data we gather that it's really good to then run through AFSIM to get more refined results on some of the more technical and quantitative data. I'm not that familiar with Birds of Prey. I've heard the name before, but I haven't played it. I haven't gotten a chance to see it. So I would appreciate more information. Always looking for more places to start from.
Phil, those are all the questions I have for now, so you can press on.
Splendid. So now we've talked a little bit about difficulty. What is gaming? Difficulties of gaming in the Air Force. I'm going to nest that with where does the Air Force want to go? In my opinion, we can't talk much about how wargaming has to be without looking how the parent organization has to be. So I have quoted General Charles C.Q. Brown, the current Chief of Staff of the Air Force. He put out a long paper from his office called Accelerate, Change, or Lose. There's a lot in it, but I pulled this quote, which I'm going to do a little bit of karaoke in case this ever becomes a podcast. Our Air Force must accelerate change to control and exploit the air domain to the standard the nation expects and requires from us. If we don't change, if we fail to adapt, we risk losing the certainty with which we have defended our national interests for decades. We risk losing a high-end fight. We risk losing quality airmen, our credibility, and our ability to secure our future. The Air Force takes the current national challenges of the Defense Department very seriously. CQ Brown takes them very seriously. And we have to shed a lot of our legacy thinking. The way it was cannot be the way it is. And it definitely cannot be the way it will be. So that means we have to divest from some of our platforms, even platforms that we really like. When I worked at Headquarters Air Force, there was a lot of talk about ultimately phasing out the B-1. I believe that's still up in the air, but they're leaning towards it. It's not that the B-1 isn't a good program. It's that we ran them ragged during the War on Terror era. The maintenance is not great for it, and because we only ever built a few of them, they're difficult to replace, or they're difficult to get replacement parts for. Likewise, the decision in the height of the Iraqi surge to do limited production of the F-22 means that the F-22 is likely not going to survive past 2030. It's just very difficult for the logistics chain for that aircraft. Does that mean that either of those are bad aircraft? Not necessarily. But the fight just isn't about what is a quality aircraft. It is what are we going to be able to do to control the air domain to the standard the nation expects. It's not, oh, well, this could do that. It could have bombs. But can it do it at the time, at the pacing, and at the extent that we need? And the conclusion increasingly about large parts of our existing force is no. Modernization is hard. Modernization is expensive. And modernization doesn't just include things like airframes and missiles. It also includes things like technological infrastructure. I think just about everybody's probably seen the viral message about buy new computers. That was from an Air Force guy. We do need new computers. I have times at work that I can't send an email to the guy in the cubicle next to me. That's not going to cut it in a high-end fight, period. So if we're not serious about all these investments, it's going to hurt. So why does that matter for wargaming? Well, wargaming should be shaping some of these expectations, and wargaming should also be looking at how do we optimize our force? How can we optimize our force? We are one small slice of that giant analytical pie. I don't want to take questions on this slide. I just wanted to sort of explain this is where the Air Force is going. If you guys do want to talk about it or ask my opinions on it, I'm happy to give them to you. But again, it's one guy's opinions. I'm by no means the authority on the Air Force. I'm just a guy that really likes Air Force wargaming. So for an overview of what is Air Force Wargaming today. Well, Air Force Wargaming today is a lot of different things to a lot of different people. It's held at multiple levels. Headquarters Air Force, HAF, has two types of wargaming. They have the small agile wargaming known as the Foxes, which is the team I was on, and they have the larger Title 10 wargaming known as the Wolves, where I still have contacts. They're the ones that run the Title 10 events each year. In addition, major commands or MAGCOMs retain their own wargaming capacity. So they are spread out at all the functionals have a wargamer. Some of the geographics have a wargaming spot, but since their geographic commands responsible for operations, that's not their priority. However, wargaming exists at places like Global Strike to help impact global strike decisions. It exists at places like AFMC to help get guide material decisions, mobility decisions, et cetera, et cetera. I've worked with a lot of these wargamers. They're all pretty professional. It's well tailored, I think, for trying to get wargamers to the right spots where decisions can be made. So they focus mostly on seminar style war games. If you come to an Air Force Title 10 war game, if you're ever invited, you'll see it tends to be seminar style, or it tends to be sort of very loose adjudication. Sometimes it might resemble more of a matrix game. They adjudicate primarily through subject matter expertise, making judgments, which is really awesome when you can summon a lot of subject matter expertise, less awesome when you can't. I will get a little bit to that in the next couple slides. We are seeing some signs of expansion. There's interest from places like the Eker Center and some computer-based automated systems. The Air Force has interest in Command PE and is using that in a few different places. They also have interest in their own internal sims being gamified. I don't think AFSIM is a candidate for that, or at least wasn't last I checked, but there is an idea for some of the sims that they're using right now with cadets and people in pilot training might be able to be scaled up and exported. I do want to talk a little bit about Agile Wargaming. One, I'm from there. I have my own bias, playing it up front. But two, I really like the mission of Agile Wargaming. Agile Wargaming belonged explicitly to what at the time was the Air Force Warfighting Integration Capability, AFWIC, and what became all of Air Force Futures. Agile Gaming was a much more narrow slice of what wargaming is. It was much more about, instead of addressing a problem for an operational scale game, it might be address one single strike platform and what kind of missiles it could use. Address one single ISR concept and how might that work. So the games designed by them are very custom, they are very low fidelity, but they are very rapid. And in an organization generating concepts, the 30% solution you can get me tomorrow is way better than the 100% solution you'll see next year. And the 70% solution you can get me in a month is way, way better. So there is a place for Agile Wargaming in the Air Force or anywhere that deals with concepts. The other interesting thing about the Air Force is that there's a lot of non-wargaming functions with overlap. So there's exercise control squadrons within the Air Force. These guys do large-scale exercises. They take a lot of people to successfully coordinate. So these are folks that are flying real-world systems or using real-world cyber ranges or other things like that to conduct their exercises. I don't want to get into what the difference is between a wargame and an exercise. That's another one, long enough to do a presentation on itself. Just trust me when I say there's overlap between the two, but they are not the same. Then Air Force Academia at AU, they do some of their own wargaming, but it doesn't really resemble wargaming externally. They take the approach of let's play historical board games for a class, which makes me happy because I love history and I love board games and I play historical board games. But generally speaking, we cannot immediately adapt them to be an analytic game. We have to heavily modify them if we do. And most of the ones they're playing in these classes are about conflicts like the Korean War, which has useful lessons for us today, but can't really be used to replicate today. We have to modify the game system too much. And especially when you start getting into the air war, the mix of old World War II aircraft and first and second generation jet aircraft is very, very difficult to replicate in the game. Not impossible, but difficult. And lastly, modeling and sim infrastructure. The Air Force is awesome at modeling and sim, exceeds expectations everywhere I've been. They've been all sorts of people throughout the Air Force have M&S backgrounds, and anywhere there's a headquarters or something resembling an Air Force think tank, such as like Checkmate, they will have plenty of operations research and M&S people, and they are great. However, they are also not wargamers. And one of the big reasons is that generally speaking, what they do making a model, or even most sims, does not involve the decision making, the human decision making that Matt Caffrey identifies in his analogy, and that I believe is imperative to what we do. I will also add, it's my opinion that we should not just consider human decision making, but human-like decision making. And what I mean by that is some of the Air Force concepts and some of the DoD concepts for artificial intelligence integration talk about the ideas that in the coming years, maybe next decade, maybe 3 decades from now, who knows, there will be AI-assisted decision makers that may make human-like decisions in terms of what they say, but they do it with the mind of a machine. That's difficult to accurately replicate. I'm not a robot, despite what certain exes of mine have accused me of. And that cannot be done one-to-one, but I do believe that a war game with a capable AI could do that. My evidence is in the commercial world. There are AIs that play chess or Go or StarCraft. They've all gotten exceptionally good at it. The types of games we look at have many more variables than those games and many more starting moves. And at least as of right now, I don't believe there's AI that could easily play any of these games. But I do believe that with the resources we have, that's something you could train. So I don't want to go off on a side tangent on AI, another fascinating topic. I do want to pause and ask questions if anybody has questions about the overall overview of what Air Force gaming looks like.
Hey, Phil. In
Yes.
terms of questions, this one I don't understand. Maybe I don't get the references. What about how VWC in St. Louis and how they model air warfare?
That's outside my knowledge as well. I have no experiences with the Virtual Warfare Center, but I'd be interested to see what they're doing.
Thanks for the clarification in the chat. I'll connect you to the person who asked, and maybe they can explain more. But that's about the only questions we have so far. You can press on.
Terrific. So I want to start strong. I want to talk about what are the strengths of Air Force Wargaming. I think the biggest one is collective and organizational knowledge. I've been regularly impressed with how many Air Force folks I've met that are just really good at whatever their day job is. It's an organization like any other, and sure, there's a couple folks that probably should have been, reassigned to Siberia a few years ago. But generally speaking, overwhelmingly, Air Force people are really good at what they do. If you tell a guy to be a fighter pilot, you train him to be a fighter pilot, he's gonna be really good at being a fighter pilot. You tell a guy to be a bomber weapons guy, same thing. Same thing with a cyber operator or security force operator, or for that matter, a chaplain's assistant. Everybody in the Air Force that I've met takes their job pretty seriously, and they do a pretty good job at it. They also have a lot of retired personnel serving in civilian and contracting capacity that can offer a lot of practical knowledge. As we're moving out of a coin stance and back towards a competition stance that looks more like the late Cold War, it's been really invaluable to get people that served during that time, that have an idea of what it's like to coordinate missions at that scale, and that aren't necessarily bound with the thinking of the last 10, 15 years. That's not to say that people from the last 10, 15 years aren't valuable, but it's valuable to have both perspectives and see how they contrast. The other thing is leadership support. I think that there is a lot of leadership support across the Air Force for wargaming. I think you get a lot of different generals that manage to attend the right games. Sometimes they don't always get the lessons I wish, and I definitely wish that they would always fund it more. But the fact is they have our back. They defend our games, they get the right people, they make the phone calls and make sure we get the right people to come to the games that we need. Lastly, I believe that Air Force Wargaming right now is very well organizationally specialized. Retaining wargamers at the MAGCOM level allows different parts of the Air Force to focus on getting the war games that they need and sending support to the war games they need. We probably don't need a security forces expert on a game about missile combat, but we probably do need a security forces expert on how do we secure those missiles when they're on the ground. So it's all about getting the right people at the right place. And generally speaking, that's what I've seen in my time in Air Force Wargaming. They get the right people to the right place. I want to do the next slide before I take questions on this. So now let's talk about challenges. So the first is communications and marketing. And helpfully, we had a self-demonstrating thing here, which is within the wargaming community, we don't talk to each other about who we are and what capabilities we have. I hadn't heard of the Virtual Warfare Center before it was mentioned here. However, I'm willing to believe that they might have any number of systems that we'd be interested in and that we could use, because one of the things about the government in general is they're always discovering what the government does. And this sounds like we're idiots. We're not. One, the government is huge. Two, the government does not advertise because we have no reason to. At least we think we don't. We are funded by the taxpayer. We don't have a profit incentive or consequences if we don't go out and market to a certain number of people in any given month. So as a result, there's all these intricate little places within the Air Force and the DoD enterprise. They're all doing great work, and none of them are talking to each other. So then you get General so-and-so who's trying to do his job and do good support for a war game that goes, I really need a war game that does X. And he doesn't realize that there's a Marine Corps organization that's been doing X for 15 years. So he puts out a new contract for the Air Force, commissions a system, and gets it built, and then we have it. And then 1 year in, we look over at the Marines and realize they have the better thing, and they've had it for 15 years, and they're willing to give it to us for free. Whoops. That happens. And in some ways, it's the nature of the beast. But I really think it's a challenge that should be addressed, and I think it needs to be addressed from within the wargaming community. I'll get more on that in solutions. I want to keep going. So this leads to wargaming demand at multiple levels being unfilled. There's people that really want a war game, but they don't understand where the wargaming centers are at, or they've only worked with one wargaming center. And if they're a strike guy who previously has only gone to the global mobility game, before they're able to do anything else, they have to ask, what's the strike equivalent to global mobility? Is there one? Can I go? Is it useful for me? Do we still do it? What classification level is that? Can I bring my friend from Great Britain? All these things largely go unanswered. They get sent to an email inbox, and that email is returned in 1 to 3 business months because the person there is doing other things. So most of the time, the DoD shouldn't focus on marketing, but wargamers really need to focus on marketing. People should know what your product is, what kind of war games you run, what kind of systems you run, what kind of capabilities you have. Do you use Command PE? Do you have AFSIM capability? What about Storm, JTLS Go? What kind of analytic engines do you have? Do you do in-house analysis, or do you send it to somebody else? Do you cooperate with other agencies that do that for you? Can I run a very narrow scope game? Can I run a very broad scope game? What kind of authority is needed to request a game for you? Very frequently, we have people that I wanted a game, but I didn't think I could ask it. And you might say, okay, well, that's some major on staff. No, I've had a full bird colonel say that because he didn't think that people were going to respond. So it's really important for people in this job to go tell other potential clients what they could do. And it's hard because you're never going to get paid any extra for that. You will not get a single cent, and there's no incentive structure that I can think of to build that. To me, it's just part of the professionalism of the job. You have to tell people what capabilities you have and why they should care. What I will lastly say is that professionals in non-wargaming jobs do not have the time to reach out on their own. If you're being contacted by a staff officer who casually mentions he has all of next Tuesday to just do whatever you want, and could you please tell him, call OSI because you found a foreign agent. People are busy. If you coordinate with them, you can make time, but they are not going to come to you with 10,000 questions unless they're vectored through somebody. So hand out cards, talk to the right people, make sure they know who you are. The next problem is modernization. So Air Force Wargaming right now is overwhelmingly seminar style. There's a place for seminar style wargaming going forward. I don't think it's obsolete, but I also don't think that it is the only thing that should be done, especially within the broad scope of exactly how many types of war games are run within the Air Force. The first thing you run into is expectation of digital games. So at this point, Air Force field grade officers are almost all millennials. These are people that grew up with video games. They expect video games. When they hear gaming, or if they have a mental model of games, they may know tabletop role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons. They may know commercial hobby board games. They may know commercial hobby war games, which has been the case on more than one occasion. But what they all know is video games. So I've been asked since I've been in this business, why aren't more war games video games? Generally, they don't understand the workload and timeline of creating video games. There's sort of this idea that you press a few buttons and the programmer goes happily to work, and 3 months later, hey, presto changeo, you got Skyrim Air Force Edition. As anybody that has worked in the commercial gaming industry can tell you, it does not work like that. And there's a lot of challenges with timelines for how do you get all the features these clients need into a digital framework, bug-free and executable by the time they actually want the game. If you have a good team, I've seen people do this well. I've seen people make engines well on this. I don't want to diss it or bash it. It's useful. But like everything else, it has limitations, and those limitations have to be scoped with expectation management. Hey, sir, they can probably get you the game you want, but you're not going to get it in 2 months. You're going to get it in 2 years. If you drop a third of the features, you may be able to get it at the end of this year. I've had to have those conversations with some folks about digital products that they've asked for. So the other problem is, when does a game engine become obsolete? If I go and pick up any game engine right now from the 90s, I can still play it and have a good time. I can play the original Fallout and have a blast, but I'm playing that for fun. In terms of an analytic engine, the things that go into the analytic engine matter. As we talk more and more about what new things are going to come on the battlefield and how are they going to work, there's a very real question for, are the game engines of today really built to play the wars of tomorrow? And if they're not, how long will it take to modify them? What does it look like when you're modifying a 15-year-old game engine? Is the infrastructure acceptable? Is it still compatible with the operating systems you have? And anybody that's worked in government IT can tell you, then there's all the regulations on the DoD side for how do you put it onto a government computer? How are you allowed to run it in a multiplayer interface? What classification level is it? Can it go on my special computers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? There's also a poor understanding of existing seminar-style games. Most people in the Air Force that participate in an Air Force Wargame don't understand the guts of what went into it and don't understand how the conclusions were reached. Especially dangerous in the seminar-style games, because these games are played through PowerPoint move sheets. Everybody in the DoD really thinks of PowerPoint as, that's how I talk to my boss. That's the thing that has to go in the staff meeting. That's the thing that has to go for the USR update. That's the thing that has to go sometime when I see him and put something in front of him. Then they come to one of these games and they say, we're going to take the same engine and they're going to use it to describe an operation. So how do these guys describe operations? They describe them like they describe them to their boss. The problem is that doesn't always give the necessary inputs to make the game run. So then White Cell and Adjudication have to fill in the blanks, and they have to think of it. The other thing about seminar style games is, at scale, they are personnel and time intensive. When you have to do subjective adjudication for 100 slides, you will stay until 2100 or 2200 at night, trying to make sure that all of these are done and that you get everybody a satisfying answer. That's painful, and it takes a lot of time that may be able to be better spent doing something else. The other thing is, how many people do you have? If you play a total free play game where the entire Air Force gets to play, for every player you have to have an adjudicator that can speak the same language as that player, and ideally be an expert in that player's field. Anybody that you have, anything they submit, you have to have somebody that can talk intelligently about it. Otherwise, it's not even really a game. So it's hard to explain that to what that is and what people can get out of it. And this ties back to marketing. I believe that if most people were told, here's when a seminar is appropriate, here's when a seminar is not appropriate, here's a seminar might partially get this, might partially not, I think that would go a long way to scoping expectations with this. The last challenge, and this is not just Air Force Wargaming, but this is DoD-wide, and Sebastian, who was kind enough to invite me here, is somebody I've talked about with this at length. There's no formal talent pipeline. For the most part, if you have a job in Air Force Wargaming or anywhere in DoD Wargaming, you got it through either the Old Boys Club and networking, which arguably are the same thing. I just think of the Old Boys Club as, hey, Bubba Air Force retiring after 20 years. I am also Bubba Air Force retired after 20 years. This is a PS13 gig for you. Come on over, buddy. I know you don't understand what wargaming is, but you and me used to be pals a long time ago, and I think you're a swell guy, so sit in the seat. That's not always as bad as it sounds, because frequently those guys, if you stayed in the Air Force for 20 years, you got knowledge I could work with. But what it does mean is that you're not specifically looking for creative type people. You're not specifically looking for ORSAs or other heavy analysis folks that have like a serious background in STEM. You're not looking for coders and programmers. And without that, the organization can suffer. Networking is friend of a friend of a friend, or insular. We have our own wargaming network. I know I've seen some familiar names in chat. My name's probably familiar to some of you. There's only so many of us out there. And we keep small lists, whether we actually write them down or just keep them in their head of this person is a good wargamer. Are they a good Air Force wargamer? Well, not really. They spent 10 years wargaming for the Army, but I know them, so why not invite them? That's not the worst way ever to do sort of staffing, but it's pretty darn close. We really need a better formal talent pipeline where we can get people that gain academic expertise in these systems, and then we value it. And there is some of that. I don't want to make it seem like there's none. When I go into my potential solutions, I'll be able to talk more. But before I talk solutions, I wanted to ask for any questions on Air Force Wargaming strengths and challenges.
All right, Phil, we got a couple different questions on this one. So the first question is, have you experienced wargaming marketing from other countries or allies?
Yes. So the biggest one I experienced was when I went to the Command PE Users Conference. We received a really instructive brief from the Luftwaffe. And they had an officer there, his name's escaping me at the moment, though I can get it from my notes afterwards if you're interested, where he talked exactly about how he used Command PE software mixed with Flight Simulator to teach Luftwaffe students. And he scoped the expectations very narrowly, so he showed this is what he did without creating an expectation of, therefore, this is the one-size tool that could do everything, because that's not true. There is no such tool. The other place I've seen it is wargaming marketing is done in our private sector. Contractors have to market because it is how they make money. So there was a boilerplate speech that I can't give you the details on because it's proprietary, but I can tell you there's a boilerplate speech from the contractor I used to work for that basically anybody we thought might be interested in wargaming, we would sit down and run them through that presentation. So I've seen it done by contractors and by foreign nations.
So building on that question, what about the successful or good marketing made it good or successful?
That's a great question. I think the biggest thing was the way they shaped their message. Marketing is 99% about delivery. Most of the things that you're being sold, whether through ads on Facebook or television or whatever else you might interact with it, the actual quality of the product is probably pretty good. It's very rare that there is a crappy product that receives widespread marketing because people just don't believe in it. So it has some kind of baseline of quality. From there, it's all about effective messaging. I think when I look at good defense marketing that I see from other people, what I'm always really impressed by is when they are able to talk with the most specificity about, I used system X to hit research or educational objectives Y in time Z. I had to take this many Luftwaffe cadets through this game this many times in a semester in order to educate them about how these operations work. I had to take this many people in an Agile game to get this objective in this time. To me, those are really the big things that pick my attention. And when I try to talk to other people about what can my organization do for you, I try to phrase it like that. Some research objectives are just not achievable for us. They're too fuzzy or they're way too technical. One of the examples I always give is you could come to my office and ask for a war game about pretending to be a cruise missile and testing that cruise missile against a variety of different targets. I can make you a game about that. It might even be a fun game, but it's probably going to be pretty useless compared to a real detailed model, or if that test body already exists, going out and just firing the missile on a range. So different people can service different problems. So I also always like marketing that speaks specifically to that and doesn't just promise, well, whatever your problem is, my magic tool can solve it. I'm very skeptical of things like that. And when I hear that in marketing, I immediately start to know.
Yeah, great points. The next question is, I've read about a war game named Kingfish Ace. Any familiarity with that? It's the one by Lieutenant Colonel Troy Pierce.
Yes, I worked with Troy Pierce. I played that game. He also came to the office that I worked at. He and I basically traded off, but I still talk with him, and LeMay is in the process of attempting to do a digital version of that game. I think Kingfish Ace is a great example of how more things can be game than people think. Logistics is perennially under game to defense wargaming, but if you go on the commercial side to Board Game Geek and look for Euro games with an industry theme or logistics theme, they're all over the place, including a lot of games with a lot of different mechanisms for delivery. Then if you go to Steam, there's all sorts of games about economy building. Well, that's all air mobility is. And ACE is even more of an economy building because what are you doing? It's airport tycoon. You're starting up all these different air bases. Where Kingfish ACE is great is it takes an approachable look at a concept that a lot of people have trouble getting their heads around. It takes a nuts and bolts approach to, okay, you've said you're going to set up this air base. What does that really mean? And then Troy will helpfully tell you, hey, you got to look at this. It has this existing infrastructure. You need to build this on it to make it work. It's a facilitated game, which also is helpful because so far the only person I've seen facilitated is Troy. So it's nice when you have the designer able to answer any of your questions about how does this work, how does that work. But I would strongly recommend Kingfish ACE if you're looking to get familiar with the ACE concept, or if you're just looking for a good mobility game to borrow from. He's got a lot of interesting mechanics in there, especially he has this wheel. It's sort of what you set up at an air base and has everything on it. It looks really busy at first, but once you understand it, it becomes very easy to fill in. So yeah, cannot speak highly enough about that game. And for Sebastian's edification, although he probably already knows this, Troy's an Air Force guy, but he made that game as his thesis at the Marine War College.
If you didn't bring it up, I was going to bring it up because when he was at Marine Corps University doing his thesis, I saw the very early version of Kingfish ACE before he really pounded it into shape, which was great. Just more proof that the Marine Corps is doing the best wargaming. Does LeMay support any exercises in terms of like CPXs or games that are embedded within exercises?
So generally speaking, we don't do a lot of direct exercise support outside of tabletop exercises, TTXs, although by exception, we have been called up to send people to CPXs.
So the next question is, what are some good resources for wargaming for beginners?
So that's one I think about a lot, and I've changed my answer on this probably every time I've answered it, because every time I have, I've found something else. I would recommend starting 3 tracks. Track 1 is to play commercial games. If you like board games, play board games. If you like video games, play video games. If you like tabletop role-playing games, play role-playing games. What you're really going to see the more games you play is that the proverbial guts of any game, the mechanics that make it tick, it's all the same. When you conduct a strike in World of Warcraft against a target, that's no different than taking HP away from a target in a D&D game. And in fact, a lot of early role-playing games were literally just automated D&D. This is like Baldur's Gate and whatnot. So the more games you can play of all sorts is beneficial. Don't trick yourself into thinking, oh, this is a game about unicorns. There's nothing I can use it for defense wargaming. Not true. The important part is understanding how the assets and entities in a game interact with each other. And when you understand that, when you understand what underpins those numbers and what makes a card better, worse, disappear, etc., you've gained valuable insight into, okay, I need to represent this complex military operation. Here's how I think I could do it as a card. So that's track 1. Track 2 is reading. I think there's a lot of good reading out there. If I could only recommend one book to start with, I would go with Matt Caffrey's On Wargaming. If you really just need the wargaming advice, I would skip the history and just focus on part 2 of the book, which talks in detail about that. Other people like other systems or other wargaming books. Mark Herman wrote one. Peter Perla's got one that I think everybody in the industry reads. It's pretty good. I think there's any number of other games. Saban has a good one too. But I would really start with Matt Caffrey. The third and final thing I would do is try to find somebody in defense wargaming that can be a mentor to you. This is still very much with no formal pipeline, this is very much a job about who do you know and who can teach you. So somebody in the wargaming field you're interested in, just start up some email correspondence with them. Hey, what does it look like to build a game like this? What does it look like to facilitate? In part, that's one of the things I think is really good about Goose is there's a lot of talent here from a lot of different places spread across. And the other thing you can find is if it's not somebody that's actively in wargaming, there's folks that are formally in wargaming that are happy to return emails in many cases. So that's really the 3-prong approach I would go for. Play games, read books, start with Caffrey on Wargaming, and talk to people that are currently in the industry.
Yeah, so we have a couple different questions, but I'll save some for later. But one thing I did want to ask is, When looking across the joint force and the future of wargaming, do you think there will be a move to a more inclusive approach to the other services? I'm assuming that is like more joint wargaming.
Yes. So I've been at a joint war game all this week. I'm not sure I'm allowed to say any more about it than that. So since these are just my opinions, I'll be quiet. But yes, I think we're absolutely moving towards that. All the major services have put out concepts that are multi-domain in nature. The Army calls it MDO. The Air Force is going with JADC2/ABMS. And I know the Marine concept now includes 10 times the maritime of previous Marines. And the Navy concept is we have to use the subsurface to unlock the air, to unlock the surface, to unlock the land. All of these services are starting to look outside of their own effects. And while I think the future of warfare is joint, it's worth noting that this approach would be familiar to men like my father, who served in the 80s, because they had to do a lot more joint work then. If you watch what happens in Desert Storm, it's one giant joint live fire exercise that just happens to be against an adversary. Everything comes together in a really, really well synchronized way. So I think the future of warfare is definitely joint. But I would also say I think more of the past is joint than sometimes we realize, especially because all services tell lies to themselves about how great they are and how everyone else is terrible.
So that's the last of the questions I want to ask for now, and you can press on, and I'll save these other questions for our next break.
Certainly. So I'm a big fan of don't bring up problems without solutions. So I want to talk about some of these solutions. The first one for communications and marketing. The first, at the top, I have attend conferences. These aren't just wargaming conferences like Connections, so Connections is good. And I plan on attending mostly in a listen mode for Connections online. You can meet a lot of people there, and they generally have a huge amount of different views and backgrounds. Besides that, though, attend other conferences. Go to the Air Force Association conference. Go to AUSA for the Army. The lobbyists are kind of slimy, I know, but they get all the right people to come there. So if you want to meet people and let them know, hey, sir, this thing you think is unsolvable, we can make a war game about it and find out exactly how unsolvable it is. That's the place to do it. In addition, there's any number of other conferences, technical in nature or perhaps professional organizations to specific sub-communities. These are pretty much always worth having somebody to attend. If I were allowed to run my center the way I wanted to, I would have somebody outbound to a conference probably at least once every other week. There's enough stuff going on out there and good people to go meet and good people to drop your card by. I think that would be worthwhile. The second thing is we really got to determine client needs better. So in the civilian world for marketing, they don't just randomly blast out ads to anybody, although it may seem like that depending on what your social media experience is. Generally, they try to target it. They try to target people that are going to buy something. So they take slices of demographics. We need to do the same thing. If you want to offer games about nuclear weapons, it probably doesn't help you very much to go to the Chaplain Corps, unless you're asking them to come to peace with Oblivion or something. You want to go somewhere where people are that have those needs, and you want to scope them as narrowly as possible. And that's the last one. You got to travel to where the clients are. There's a lot of reluctance within wargaming for, I don't want to go to them. They should email me. I get it. That's my preferred way to operate too, but it's not healthy. You have to go out and you have to see people and you have to talk to them and you have to show them what you can do. For modernizations, so I think the first thing we should do is seek out appropriate digital solutions. The emphasis on that is appropriate. There's a lot of commercial off the shelf and government off the shelf, COTS and GOTS for short. They're frequently capable enough for most wargame needs, or failing that to serve as a baseline that you then modify, play better. And again, I put it down here. I probably said it 50 times tonight. Hopefully I'll say it 50 more. Scope needs. Do not promise people the moon. And furthermore, beware of people who do. The guy that shows up at your shop and says, hey, look behind this counter. I have the one-stop whiz-bang ultimate wargame adjudication system that will do everything you need. It slices, it dices. You can cut a tin can with it. That person is not to be trusted. No system so far can master everything in war at perfect fidelity. It is not possible. War is too complex. Maybe depending on how AI turns out, there may be something that is the all-knowing Clausewitz bot 5000. But as of right now, that system doesn't exist, and it doesn't look like it's going to exist in the future. So be careful about people that say this is the tool that will solve wargaming. You really have to get the appropriate tools for the appropriate needs. The ideal wargaming shop, in my mind, has a mix of different models in sim and different wargame engines to run for different clients. You don't need perfect rules for everything in every wargame. And especially talking about digitization, where the more load you give a programmer, the longer it's going to take them to get you anything workable, let alone anything useful, is going to extend. So you got to be really quick. It's not just don't promise the moon. Don't demand the moon either. Try to scope your needs. I think we should continue to advocate analog solutions. I think there's still a place for seminar gaming. I think seminar gaming really shines in things like how do you deal with a competition or a crisis phase problem. I think that's an area of wargaming that's getting more and more attention, and it should. And there's not a good way to quantify how the ambassador from the People's Republic of China is feeling today. I mean, we could do like a D&D, wandering monster table where you roll 1d20, and in a 1 he's really angry, and a 20 he's happy and loves America. But that's not realistic. That's not really going to help you with that. Whereas getting somebody who's spent a lot of time working with somebody like that, like say the Chinese ambassador. So you get an American ambassador that's met with the Chinese ambassador a bunch of times, and he comes to your game. He could be very, very helpful during a seminar style game like that. I also think that there's rigid rules based gaming such as board games that also have a lot of lanes going forward. I hear sometimes, we shouldn't play this. This is just a board game. Why can't we digitize it? Why can't we analog? Or why can't we automate more of that? I think there's a time and place to automate board games. If your board game has 400 combat results tables and each one of them requires an individual check, you should probably seek an automated solution for that. And furthermore, a simple script would be pretty easy for that, since all it's doing is rolling and accessing tables. But for some other systems, it's not appropriate, or the amount of work you put in just isn't worth what you get out, or it's about something too fuzzy. One of my favorite board games is Jason Matthews and Ananda Gupta's Twilight Struggle, which is probably maybe my favorite board game of all time. It's debatably a war game. I think it is. There's people on BGG that'll get mad at you if you say that, but I think it is. But what it's really good about is taking an incredibly abstract problem, the history of the Cold War, and doing simple, broad quantification of it. So when I say I'm committing a coup in El Salvador, does that literally mean that I've called up the 82nd Airborne to go knock them over and the diplomatic consequences of that are nothing? No, that's tied up into the role that I do something. I back a rival party. I get their military to do a coup. I use my military to do a coup. I get something that's a functional coup within their democratic system, but it ends with I have more influence in that country. So a lot of times for decision makers, the details really aren't important. The technical stuff doesn't matter. In my hypothetical coup in El Salvador, it really doesn't matter if the deniable asset that goes to kick it off is using an M16A1 or a musket. It doesn't. The important thing is, does the coup succeed or not? And that goes back to the scope needs thing for what is the game supposed to do? Why is it supposed to do it? Point is, though, that's still a good place for board games, still a lot of good places for board games. I don't think board games are dying in DoD. And furthermore, I don't think that board games or seminar games or role-playing games are fundamentally at odds with digital games. I think that they're very complementary. Right now in the commercial space, we are seeing all-time high sales of Dungeons & Dragons, a tabletop RPG from the 70s. And granted, 5th edition is substantially different from the first one that came out, but a lot of people like it. And these same people also have access to World of Warcraft or Skyrim or Elder Scrolls Online, or pick your favorite MMORPG currently in service. But they choose to play D&D. This shows that there's things you can get out of an analog game that, at least where we're at now, you can't get out of a video game. Some of it is as simple as the calculus changes when I have 5 people standing around a map looking at it together versus 5 people in 5 different states looking at a computer screen. I think one of the things that COVID showed us is that there's a lot of things we can do distributed, but there's definitely something lost when you can't see physically everybody you're talking to, especially the longer that goes on. But the big thing, and I still file this under marketing, is you have to get the right game system in front of the right clients. You got to figure out who's going to respond well to the automated games you want. You got to figure out who is going to respond well to your board games. Who do you need to invite to your seminar games? It's all about the right people. You got to get people that are going to be able to address their objectives through this. But what about the talent pipeline? Well, there's no career field for wargaming. I'd like to see one, and I think we could probably start one. There's 0 uniformed officers in the Air Force currently that have a wargame specific career field. All uniformed officers I've met in a wargaming shop are temporarily assigned. They have normal duties in the operational force. They go back to be a B-52 Guizot or an ORSA or a physicist or a C-130 pilot or whatever other job they might have. There's no path for outsiders to get into Air Force wargaming. I don't want to dismiss my own talents. I got hired for a reason. I'm not totally incapable. But I also basically stumbled backwards into this job. I came into wargaming because I happen to know somebody who was in wargaming. And just about everybody that I know in wargaming, that's how they got into it too. I think a lot about how much talent exists outside the Air Force that could solve Air Force problems. There may be a guy or gal out there who has played Next War Taiwan 400 times, and it's all they do every day when they get home from work. And they know how that game works inside and out, and they have an idea of the operational problem presented in that game, and they have a familiarity with it that I don't, and that other people doing my job don't. I don't have any way to reach these guys. I can try Twitter, but I've been on defense Twitter, and much like the rest of Twitter, it's there's a quality problem. The people that are the happiest to talk the loudest are the people you don't want in a wargaming shop, and you definitely don't want talking to general officers. So you have to spend time sorting through them, and I don't have time for that. Definitely not in a professional capacity. So how do you find these folks? I don't really know. I don't have a great answer for that. That's one that, despite the fact I'd like to propose a solution, like I can propose a solution, let's have a wargaming career field. I don't think I'll be taken seriously on that. I think the Air Force has other priorities, but it would solve the problem of getting uniformed personnel. I don't know how to solve the current talent problem, but I am seeing some seeds of hope. So Air War College is already adopting more war games. They are interested in looking at a war game called the Operational Wargame System, OWS. I like OWS. I think it's pretty good. I am contractually obliged for Sebastian Butts In. That's another game invented by the Marines. But despite that limitation, it is a pretty good game for describing modern operations. It can get a little bulky at scale, just like everything else. But I was really happy to hear that AWC was looking at adopting that. I think that's a great way to get the Air Force's 06s into sort of what kind of wargaming exists at their level to help them solve their problems. ACSC already teaches a wargame course. That's the Air Command and Staff College, for those of you who are not familiar with Air University lingo. You can take that course at the Army Command and Staff College. You can write your paper on wargaming. So there's the foundations of a wargaming pipeline that we might be able to look back in 10 years and pull all these people that wrote war games as their thesis, like Lieutenant Colonel Troy Pierce or Colonel Chris Deneau, an Air Force intel officer who he did it as an Air War College thesis, also built a war game. Air Force officers have made war games for other services war colleges. That is exactly, it's literally Troy Pierce, since he's already come up. That's something that I think is really reassuring to see, that when we send people on exchange, they're encouraged to war game. I think that's awesome. And lastly, the Air Force Academy. I know not all officers come from an academy, but USAFA does have a good wargaming department. Pigeon Fielder really made his mark there. He's a legend in USAFA or in Air Force wargaming, and I think in commercial wargaming at large. And I mean, he had an excellent talk here with Bruce about that. He's a really bright guy, and he left his stamp on that. And since then, they've just continued to do excellent things. But what I have under the picture is how many future wargamers are in that photo. This is a graduating class of 2020 Air Force Academy. And I don't know any of these cadets. I wouldn't have a chance to. How many of them might have had an interest in wargaming? How many of them took a wargaming course at USAFA or in a wargaming club? I don't know. We never invited them to LeMay. Wish we would have. Wish we will. So that's it for solutions. What do you guys think? Questions?
So one thing before we leave this slide deck is building on Pigeon's work at the U.S. Air Force Academy. I know Kylie Hunter and others like Major Jameel Brown have been doing a lot of wargame work with their multi-domain lab. I think that's the last name they have, which has a wargamer on staff, and I know they're trying to do a lot more educational wargaming. They feature like a fictional Hokkaido scenario for the academy, and I know they're trying to do a lot more work trying to get it into the curriculum. So there is hope. You know what I mean? Nonetheless. But in terms of more questions, some video games such as the Ace Combat series include real-world sponsorship with industry. Could the Air Force Wargaming use such products to develop war games? You know what I mean? This is sort of in line with like the esports team for the Air Force, I believe.
Yes, I think that's challenging. We're always interested in working with the commercial video gaming community. HAF had several attempts to do that while I was there. It basically always breaks down because we can't get clearances for a lot of the people there without spending a lot of money, and the amount of money they want for the contract is already a lot. I don't want to write that off as hopeless. I think it's a venue to explore, but I think it's a venue that really has to be navigated more by, one, we have to come to peace with not everybody that needs to work on a war game needs a security clearance. They don't. I can have a guy who specializes in a coding language, and I can tell him I just need him to build me pictures of airplanes fighting each other. And he can probably do a pretty good job about that, and he doesn't need no secret. I have a different guy that when we pass that up to a higher side, we do. I think the other thing, though, is contracting is a mess in and of itself. I really wish I had a better answer for that, but I think that's got to be done very creatively. I think it's very easy to do with a recruiting context, such as Air Force Esports, which, one, yeah, it is to get airmen and cadets sort of a way to see the broader world, but it's mostly recruiting. And that's a good thing. We want to show people that are fans of esports, hey, the Air Force could have a place for you. But I don't necessarily think that that would well serve our analytic objectives.
So the next question is, do you know an example of an Air Force Matrix game that you're familiar with, and what were the goals and scope, and was it effective in your mind, keeping in mind classification and such?
Yes. My colleague Nate Fritz, when I was at the Foxes, built a Matrix game for the Air Force, and I wish I could tell you what it was about, but I can tell you that he did it, and for what we were talking about, for the format he was in, and it was a very limited number of participants game, we found it to be highly effective. Again, that's why I really believe the most important part of the game is really aggressively scoping down what the research or education objective is, and then just ruthlessly following that.
So keeping on that topic a little bit, what do you think makes a Matrix game effective in a particular context, or I mean, what makes certain types of Matrix games better than others? I mean,
I would have to think about that. I mean, besides picking a good objective and making sure you know what you want to talk about, I think one of the keys in Matrix Wargaming is facilitation. That's when you really got to bring out good speakers and good arguments to really get the game to be played. I know, again, going back to my coworker Nate, he's an expert facilitator. He's my first choice for any time I need to pick a facilitator. He's just a very friendly guy, very smart, very good at talking to people. And I found that will bring out a lot of conversation in other folks who previously would be hesitant. I think that's probably one of the biggest differences between a good Matrix war game and a bad Matrix war game. The whole core of the game is arguing your point to try to get more effects. And if you have people that don't want to argue, and you have one guy that's just a really loud jerk, which is usually my role in the room, they have a way of sort of stomping on otherwise useful inputs, and then maybe they take decisions in an ineffective way that if they could have argued better, could have been better. But I need to say this is mostly hypothetical. I participated in a couple Matrix war games, but I have not personally ran them.
So for those who are unfamiliar with what a Matrix game is, we're not referring to the commercial company that makes like Command PE, but a type of game structure and design. I put a link in the chat for those who are interested in learning more about Matrix games. There are a bunch of educational unclassified games that hit DoD topics. Next question is, do you know any good asymmetrical Air Force games?
So if you're talking asymmetrical, I would ask a clarification to the question answer. Do you mean asymmetrical as in one side primarily has like ground-based fires, or Do you mean one where I have all Vietnam era aircraft and you have all 2020 aircraft?
I think it was more the former than the latter.
Okay. I'm aware of some that play like that, but they generally tend to play asymmetric in favor of the U.S. Like that's Dan Burson Games Leader Series built off the Hornet Leader. You get an entire squadron of USN/USMC aircraft, and the enemy gets a scattered number of SAMs and a handful of fighters to fight you at every objective you go to. So they usually have way more ways to hurt you, but their stuff isn't as good. That's one. In terms of other board games for asymmetric, there's some scenarios in Red Storm where one side has way more SAMs than the other. I'm seeing in chat asking, no, more like coin series, distant plane. Do I buy Reapers or invest in locals, for example? I'm not sure I know one exactly like that, although Chris Denote, the one he made might scratch your itch because it's a game about disaster response. So it's asymmetric in the sense that you're committing limited assets to try to rescue people. But even that is pretty far away from coin. I think that there is a potential market for those games, both analytically and definitely commercially. I like the idea of sort of you have a limited number of funds. Do you spend on better air support or investing in locals? I guess one that might kind of scratch that same itch is there's a computer game called Rebel Inc., where you basically run the local government of Afghanistan and you try to squash an insurgency. And you do have an investment chain, and you can choose whether or not you invest more in infrastructure, more in military stuff, more in law enforcement stuff. So there could be mechanics there that you could then take and build for that. The only thing is, to me, that sounds like a game greater than service level. If you're starting to do major budget assignments at the government level, that's like OSD level or maybe even senior executive branch.
So this is from someone who did wargaming back in the Luftwaffe in 98 to 2000. They had major challenges in combined use of Air Force with Army and Naval forces, you know what I mean? So essentially joint warfare. What are some major challenges that you see in this kind of joint warfare, combining Air Force, air power, and sort of other domains at the same time in war games? You sort of hit on it before in your presentation.
That is a really terrific question, though. And I want to answer it by first running to OSINT and current events. If you want to know what failure to integrate with your ground forces look like, the Russians are doing a stellar job of showing us that in Ukraine. Just on the open source level, not telling you guys any secret squirrel stuff, you can find this in the news. Their air force is largely not shown up. And the reason is they're out of good stuff, and dropping dumb bombs in an area where you have your own troops requires either an incredible amount of precision or an incredible amount of we just don't care about the service below. And the more you do the second, the less that service is going to keep calling you in. So with that, what are some of the challenges you face in a game? The biggest one in terms of most types of challenges or most numerous challenges, and this is a very low impact thing, but it happens a lot of times in any joint war game, is terminology. Everybody in the military has slightly different terminology for things. If you ask an Air Force guy what MCON is, he's going to give you a different status reading than if you ask a Navy guy what MCON is. Despite the fact they both agree it's a missions condition, and they both agree it's how many sensors on your platform are operating. But they've broken them down differently. One uses numbers, one uses letters, and then what they mean specifically is different because they all have different systems. For example, Air Force aircraft don't worry about subsurface domain and sonar, period. Unlike some other nations' air forces, we do not own our maritime patrol aircraft. Those are entirely within the Navy. Nobody in the Air Force that spent their entire career in the Air Force has any training on sonar. But to maritime operators I've talked with, they think a lot about not just what the picture is above the water, but what the picture is below the water. So trying to explain this across services for how that works is one of the things that always happens in large numbers. Now, thankfully, terminology explanations are usually pretty simple. I'm sorry, what did you mean by that? I meant this. Okay, good. But they happen all the time. The most recent example that I've seen is the Army Operations Center uses the term AOC, or sorry, the Army Operating Concept for 2040 uses AOC. I think of that as an Air Operations Center. So we have the same acronym, and the Army's using it for a future development concept, and the Air Force is thinking, we already have AOC, and they're both right. They're talking past each other. And this can create a lot of drama. One of the other things is like long-range fires. What are long-range fires to the Air Force? You're talking hundreds of nautical miles. What are long-range fires for the Army? Well, you could be talking about a rocket-powered howitzer round, but the distance that travels is very short for the Air Force, so they may not recognize that. And you get a lot of sort of little things like that. It's impossible to get rid of all of them, but it's important to be aware about. I think the other thing that comes up is that the services don't understand how the other services fight. Coming from an Army background and going to the Air Force, I was surprised by the speed. I was surprised by when you could have effects and on what, with what, at what time. The Air Force might be able to get the same amount of combat power to a place as the Army for a 2-hour time span, but the Air Force is not going to stay, and the ground forces are persistent. They don't rebase. They sleep in their tents and their foxholes, and they fight from there. The Navy is a little bit different to me, and always surprising just because it looks from a 30,000-foot view very simple. They have, it's a single ship. When I think about a single Air Force aircraft and what goes into that, that's not so bad. And then I talk to maritime people, and what goes on in a single ship is a lot. And it's multi-domain effects. They do air defense, they do subsurface defense, they do ground fires, they have to do all these different little tasks, and they're all important, and they have to be trained in all of them. But they don't do it quite like anybody else. Their air defenders are not like Army air defenders. Naval aviators, who obviously wouldn't be on like a destroyer, but they might coordinate with a destroyer, they're not exactly like Air Force aviators, even though they use a lot of common terminology. And Marine aviators are different because they're dedicated support for the Marines. So I think that's another thing, is the misunderstanding of tactics. I think the last one, which is probably the least important, is the misunderstanding of capabilities. I say it's the least important because I found if there's one thing people in other services know, they have a general idea of what capabilities you bring to the fight. I don't know if this is because it's really easy to read Janes, or because a lot of these things are similar. A cruise missile off a ground-based system, a cruise missile from a B-52, and a cruise missile from a destroyer are all going to be a little bit different, but they're all cruise missiles. People understand what that capability is. They may not understand the extent of that capability, and sometimes this backfires when you have a bad mental model and you think, I already know what Weapon X is, and it turns out Weapon X, when employed from the air, has some really interesting capabilities that it doesn't from the surface. So that was probably a long, rambling answer. That's honestly a great enough question for, once again, I think we're on like 3 or 4 topics that really deserve their own night.
No, you're doing great, Phil. So I'll switch it up with an easy question. Are you planning to go to Connections 2022 this year, I believe in July at IDA?
So I'm hoping to. I do have a potential conflict with a service game I've been requested at. But I'm hoping to at least get free for a little bit and be there in person.
For those who are unfamiliar with the Connections Wargaming Conference, it is the US-based professional wargaming conference that's done every year. It usually is held by a FFRDC or federally funded research center, or hosted by a service university. A couple years ago, it was at Carlisle in 2019, and this year is at IDA, which is also FFRDC. I put the link in the chat for those who may be interested in the DC, Northern Virginia area. So next question is, what do you think is the biggest challenge facing U.S. Air Force wargaming community writ large?
The hard part is making me pick one. I think the 3 challenges that I mentioned are definitely the 3 things that I'm most concerned about. But I think for wargaming in general, and not just specifically the Air Force, it really is that talent pipeline. So a lot of our older folks that have expertise left over from the Cold War, they're not aging out of the military. They're aging out of the GS positions because they're 65, 70. They're ready to retire, and I don't blame them. I love my job, but I'm really hoping when I'm 65, I get to go just play commercial board games for fun all day with my family. I don't want to still have to learn about what's the Air Force going to be like in 2070. That seems like a lot. And I'm sympathetic to these guys who have already watched their service change many, many times, and now in the twilight of the career, they're asking to be relearn it again. I don't think we should write that off as a small thing. People who have had to build constructively 20 different models of the Air Force in their head for 30 plus years, that 21st one might just break them. And if we don't have people ready to backfill them, capable people with good ideas and creative solutions, I think that's a concern. I've seen enough raw talent out there. There's enough people that could do this job if they wanted to, but I'm really concerned that we don't have a way to reach them. I am hoping that the seeds of hope that I've seen give us great war gamers in 5-10 years. I'm hoping that when somebody like Troy Pierce looks at getting out, they really consider, well, why not just go do wargaming full time? But all those guys got their own things too.
So do you have any experience conducting Air Force War Games via Zoom or like SVTC or just remotely, virtually?
I do. I have run a game via Teams, MS Teams. I can't tell you what the game was about, even though it was unclass. It was one of those things where we briefed it unclass and the next game built on it was not. But what I can tell you is distributed gaming is hard. Distributed gaming is not impossible. And if you want the best way to do it on the cheap, find somebody familiar with Roll20, the online D&D game. Or it's really it's a role-playing game engine you can use to play D&D, but it's free. And it's a way to make a game work in a distributed lane. I didn't use that. I used that as the framework for what I built to help these guys play. But I found that much more my experience being a dungeon master on the nights and weekends helped me figure out how to reach Air Force clients and engage with them during an online distributed game. I do want to say that is the biggest thing you have to watch out for in distributed gaming is player engagement. In a room, it's very easy to see who's tuning in, who's doing what. Via camera, you could have a guy who's well into his War Thunder grind for the day, not paying any attention, just going, mm-hmm. So you got to be really vigilant about that. Most people won't tune out because they hate you. The actual War Thunder guy doesn't exist. That's just an example. But people are people. They have to answer emails. They have to deal, especially if they're teleworking from home, they have to deal with their family or pets or any number of other things. You really got to watch that.
So this next question is a little complicated, so I'll break it into two parts. Is to what extent do you expect emerging technologies and platforms over the next 10 to 20 years to affect some of the specific challenges that you identify within Air Force Wargaming?
Well, I think some of them are going to be helpful. I think some of them are going to be less helpful. I think the ones that are helpful, we should seek to incorporate and use when we can. I think we shouldn't be afraid of technology. I think we shouldn't be afraid of the idea of what if this obsoletes X, because having worked for the government for over a decade, the government does not believe in the term obsolete for anything. If we have to include a battlefield AI, there will be one person who is the AI whisperer who will be in charge of making sure the AI is happy today and that it has enough cooling in its server room or whatever. And that person will come to the game too. So I think it's kind of silly that we have some fear about we can't do this because we won't have work. Well, no, we'll still have work. There's so much work to be done here. We need the help we can get. I think the big challenge is going to be classification. The Air Force doesn't like to share its nicest toys with the world. And that limits us when we talk with our allies and partners. That limits us when we talk with students. It limits us when we talk with other services. Not every other service has the same density of high clearance people the Air Force has. So I think the other challenge that's going to present is how do you wargame the unprecedented? People have done it. We have records of that. We have discussions about the Manhattan Project and other things. But within the next 20 years, we could see battlefield effects that are like nothing we've seen before. I do want to go on the record and say I don't think that's the case right now. I know there's a lot of hysteria about loitering munitions, but loitering munitions aren't as new as people think. And they are not the T-1000. They are a very smart Hellfire. So I hope that answers that question.
So the next question is related to the first one is to the extent for classification limits allowed, do you think it will be any easier or harder to game out the use of some of the new assets and capabilities likely to be rolling out over that time frame? So the way I read this is not only how do you war game something that doesn't exist, right? This is a challenge I have when I do future games. It's like a service comes to you and you're like, hey, this is the capability that only exists on PowerPoint, right? Please wargame it for me. But also some things that you mentioned in terms of classification, but also jointness.
So I think the classification is the bigger problem of the two. I think we're very blessed that there's so much access to the commercial world, and the folks in science fiction and fantasy gaming have thought about so many crazy things that exist, and how they could be gamified. I think you can at least start with a baseline. I just think the big problem you run into is you don't have anything to check it against. You're measuring an abstract against an abstract. That's always going to be really challenging. So I think the important thing is you just take good notes and be consistent. If you've represented it one way, keep representing that way until you have a way you don't. If you get flight data and it turns out this thing doesn't work the way you thought, do that.
So in that regard, switching to easier, more in casual question is, what is a recent game you've been sort of playing and sort of obsessed with commercially?
Commercially recently, well, I will drop a line since I am actively playing this for the next 4 weeks. I'm in an online tournament for Kevin Bertram's Shores of Tripoli, which I guess is just Marine Night, Sebastian. You lucked out. Which is a game about one of the famous first engagements of the Marines in the early 1800s. He's running a tournament right now. The actual guy that created the game. I'm playing 2 games a week for the next 4 weeks, and I wouldn't have signed up for it if I wasn't excited. That's a really slick game. The design is very smart. It's card driven, and it brings the history to life while still remaining a competitive game. I think some other games that I've been interested in recently. I got Help Arrives, which is from Draco Ideas. That's another war game I liked recently. That's about the Spanish Civil War, which I think is perennially undergamed. The Spanish Civil War is really important because it's the preview to World War II. There's 2 wars that kick off at the same time in the 30s, which is the Spanish Civil War and the Second Sino-Japanese War, which is Japan attempting to invade China. And the second one continues seamlessly into World War II. The first one shows off a lot of the new technology. I think that very much represents what we're seeing right now, where we're starting to see a lot of new stuff on the battlefield. The battlefield of the 80s is still more or less around, but it's running at like warp speed because of what's changed in the cyber domain. And I think we're approaching the end of that. Maybe not within the next 10 years, but within the next 20 or 30, we're going to start seeing stuff that doesn't resemble the 80s at all. And I think we need to be ready for that. I think the observers at the time that were looking at how are the Japanese fighting in China, how are the Chinese fighting, and how are the 2 sides fighting in the Spanish Civil War, I think they had a lot to learn too. So it may seem a little bit reductive. I'm going back to play the preview game for World War II, and there's hundreds of World War II games out there, but it's just something I've studied a lot, and that's something that makes me happy. So those are 2 war games I've been playing recently.
So I will say that Goose also has a team in the wargaming tournament for Shores of Tripoli, the Littoral Commanders, and we'll see you in the brackets there, Phil. All right, so another thing is we like to ask 2 sort of questions to all of our speakers at the end of their presentations. One is, if you had unlimited money, unlimited time, and you can get anyone to design this game, right? What is a game that you would want to either design yourself, right? A topic that you always wanted to design but couldn't find someone to fund it for work, or to have someone design a game for you or for someone else?
So if we were going to do the game I really want to design for the Air Force is a really high-speed mix manual and analog game on information warfare. I think one of the things we're seeing a lot out of Ukraine is that the internet as a messaging battle space matters a lot in terms of how does the military help influence both military ops, but also the delever of dime. I think there's a lot to that, and I think that there is a lot we should be looking at. I can say that 16th Air Force, which is the Air Force's IW numbered Air Force, they're very serious about that too. They're watching and they're learning. And I think that's going to be super important. The problem is, how do you make a good game on that? Well, that would have to be like this huge mixed role-playing game that would also still have to have really great adjudication for what's actually going on in the battlefield to represent realistic operations that then you have to message for. And then I'd want dedicated role players, or ideally actual foreign nationals that were able to come in from clear countries and pitch them sort of the IW that's going on in real time and see how they're affected by it. Do they buy into it? So I think that's my perfect game, is the ultimate information operations game. And it will never work because I will need way too much money for it. But you guys said infinite.
No, that's great. There's a recent game that I've been sort of trying to get onto the table and which haven't assembled it yet is a game called Air Skirmouche, which is a tactical 2-player game that has like a phone app to it, but it's like a traditional, like it looks sort of like Birds of Prey in a lot of ways. But I'm looking forward to potentially use that for my classroom. So that's a game that's on my radar recently, and I'll put the link in the chat for those who are interested. So the last question I have for you is, what are some influences or inspirations, typical, whether they be board games, or atypical in terms of, you know, I mean, a different hobby that has made you a better war game designer?
So I think there's a lot. I don't think there's just one, but I'll try to keep this list short. For games that really made me a better designer, I think Hornet Leader from Dan Verson Games is one that really gave me a sense of what you could do with a solitaire game. Solitaire board gaming is really, really, really impressive in a way that I didn't think it is. I'm a child of the video games era. To me, board games were something I played with friends, and video games are something I played with friends or just by myself. Solitaire board games still have a pretty good niche for entertainment for me. Maybe I'm just old-fashioned that way. In terms of hex and counter games, I think Mark Herman's Empire of the Sun is probably the single most impressive game I've ever played. I really have a strong interest in the Pacific War and World War II. So that's one of the best ways to do it. The only downside is it is a big, bulky game. So you have to either play it solitaire or play it with somebody that has an entire Saturday. In terms of non-war games, I think playing a lot of TTRPGs helps. The one I'm going to recommend the most is a horror game called Delta Green, which is really what if the X-Files was like extra dark. But it's pretty useful for understanding what kind of mechanics could you use to represent like mental damage or fear. And the gunfighting in that is really, really lethal, which, talking to people that have had to deal with gunfights, a lot of systems don't have it lethal enough. I will leave it at that. For video game wise, I think that there's many games that have helped make me a good game designer video game wise, some helping me scope narrative, some helping me get an idea of what's important in the game. I think I'll go with Wargame Red Dragon, which Sebastian knows that I love, and I have more or less begged him to play several times, and he has, to his credit. That game's a lot of fun. It's about combat in the 80s and 90s in the Pacific. And it's not perfect. The air in it is not correct at all. The naval in it is not really correct. And the ground needs help. But the thing about a model is it doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be good enough to show you what it's trying to do. And you do end up taking a lot of lessons away from that game about what was the joint fight like in the 1980s or 1990s.
So that's all for our presentation. I really appreciate you taking the time, Phil. I know you're traveling as well for work, so we really appreciate you doing this. For those who have are interested, we have our YouTube channel. We'll have all of our recordings, including this one, if you're interested in looking back at some of our other series webinars. So thank you again, Phil, and I appreciate you taking the time.
No problem at all. Thank you for having me.